All right. Welcome to an exploration of anarchism. So, we are conceptualizing revolutionary socialism from classical to contemporary. So, for starters, what in the hell is anarchism? And is it an ideology? In modern terms, anarchism has morphed into anarchy, a description of an ideal rather than an ideology. So, thinking back to our textbook here, calling anarchy an ideal or a system of governance. So, for example, democracy, anarchy, oligarchy, autocracy. So, these ideas of systems of government, of ideas. There are many flavors of anarchism, and anarcho has been used as a stem to differentiate anarchist ideologies. So we will explore some of these ideological variants, but first we need to establish what is anarchism, and since there is an ism, is it an ideology? Because there's anarchism and then there's anarchy. What's the difference? Well, let's go to the etymology. So in Greek, an means without, and archos means chief or ruler. So anarchy means without ruler, and anarchism is the belief in no rule. So Pierre Joseph Proudhon coined the term anarchism first in the mid-19th century to describe his political beliefs, which were more formalized in the Marxian scene with the works of Mikhail Bakunin. And there was some people that predated Proudhon too, and we'll look a little bit at Godwin, well, mainly just the name, but there has been thinkers that have predated Bakunin, but Bakunin is like the Marx of anarchism, and I mean, anarchism, as we'll see, is very linked to socialism. But basically, what that means is there was a history of people doing stuff before some guy sat down and started writing about this is a way people govern themselves. So that's something to keep in mind too as we look at it. It's this idea that these systems are already existing outside of some thinker just writing it on a piece of paper. They're writing about observations of the world that are already existing and arguably still exist today, as we'll look at contemporary anarchist thought as well. There are versions of anarchism, or not there are versions. Bakunin and Proudhon's version of anarchism, the original iteration, can also be referred to as revolutionary socialism, also initially referred to as social democracy and democratic socialism, but these have broader meanings and are debated among socialists today. So it should be noted that communism is under the umbrella of revolutionary socialism as well. So anarchism is somewhat synonymous with the idea of revolutionary socialism, but communism also follows under the umbrella of revolutionary socialism. And I have a diagram that breaks that down a little bit more, and we'll talk about it. And the divide between communism and anarchism is a great divide among revolutionary socialism. So this revolutionary socialism, or anarchism, is a clear ideology. So keep in mind here the four functions of an ideology. An ideology is explanatory. As we will see here, there's a clear explanatory factor of revolutionary socialism, anarchism. An ideology is evaluative. It makes evaluative claims. Anarchism definitely makes evaluative claims, at least, again, this form of anarchism, the OG anarchism, if you will. And then there's an orientation, it's orientative. So the idea that it has a common identity of people, and I think it's very clear in socialism what the common identities are as far as proletariat and the bourgeoisie are concerned. And the rallying call is very strong. And as you can see in the background here, this is actually the anarchist flag or libertarian socialist flag. Another term synonymous with anarchism is libertarian socialism. So revolutionary socialism, libertarian socialism, anarchism, all mean the same thing. But yeah, this is the flag in the background, and we'll get a little bit more into the red and the black and what the difference is and the whole story behind it with the Paris Commune. Well, I'll touch about that just a little bit. but yeah, so it's this idea that there's a common rallying of people, and as you'll see throughout history, I mean, there's music, literature, art, all centered around anarchism. So it's not merely an ideal type, and it has branched into several schools as well, and that's how I said in the previous slide, the anarcho, and we'll get into that as well. Well, a lot of people say, well, doesn't anarchy mean chaos? Well, Noam Chomsky answers this question quite well, I think. Anarchy as a social philosophy has never meant chaos. So yes, anarchy, and he talks about this, anarchy does have another word in the English dictionary that means literally chaos. But it also means without rules. So there's two different versions. So anarchy as a social philosophy has never meant chaos. In fact, anarchists have typically believed in a highly organized society, just one that's organized democratically from below. So if you remember that kind of conceptualization of the hierarchical pyramid, where you have, like, for example, in feudalism, or you have the king at the top, and then after the king you have the lords and the knights, and then under those you have, the tenants, and then under those you have the serfs. And so it's this idea of a hierarchy where power is concentrated at the top, and then it is distributed out to the bottom, so where the bottommost part of the hierarchy, the most amount of people have the least amount of power. That's how capitalism works too. Not everyone can be the bourgeoisie, because that's unsustainable in capitalism. It wouldn't make sense, because if everyone had all of the power, all of the wealth, all the material, then the system itself would cease to exist, and it would actually usher in socialism, which is saying, instead of power being concentrated at the top and being distributed downwards in that power pyramid, instead power is concentrated at the bottom, and any power that is, quote unquote, put up to other levels of society in these kind of organizations, or communist committees, or different conceptualizations of these organizations, they only give the power based on the consent of the majority. So it's this idea that the committees are only as powerful as the people who run them, and the people who run them is the entirety of the democratic populace, and we'll get more into that as well. So another quote that I really like is, "Anarchism is not a fixed, self-enclosed social system, but rather a definite trend in the historical development of mankind, which, in contrast with intellectual guardianship of all clerical and governmental institutions, strive for the true, unhindered unfolding of the individual and social forces in life." So Rocker, who we'll talk about, Rudolf Rocker, a bit more in depth when we get to anarcho-syndicalism. But basically what Rocker is saying here is that anarchism, and this goes back to what I was saying before, it's not some fixed, enclosed social system that someone just opened a book and started writing a piece of paper and said, this is how society should be. No, many anarchists actually base their analysis on pre-existing evidence of anarchism. So they see anarchism in the world already happening naturally, organically, via the workers, and so they're now writing about that pre-existing system. And we'll see that when we get to Kropotkin, who focuses specifically on evolutionary socialism, this idea of looking at socialism through the eyes of evolution, and looking at examples in human nature where the animal kingdom is actually oriented towards mutual aid instead of competition. Because that's a common economic liberal argument is about social Darwinism, is that, well, we're naturally competitive human beings and we all have to fight for limited resources and all that. And a lot of anarchists say, well, look at all of these examples in human history where we're not doing that, where there's this historical trend that seems to be that the mass majority of people want out of their ruling class. In feudalism, the reason they transferred to capitalism was because they were tired of the kings. They were tired of the feudal lords. They were tired of people bossing them around and ruling them. And then they got to capitalism and they realized, oh, it's kind of the same deal. It's a little better. We've improved stuff, and Marx gives capitalism a lot of praise in that regard because it has improved upon the previous system of feudalism, but by no means is this ideal, because human nature, according to anarchists, runs counterthetical to these concentrations of power, one person having power over another person. So that's kind of one of the central themes of anarchism, is this idea that no one should have this kind of unbridled power over another person's liberty. Okay? So some key thinkers chronologically, and we're not going to go into all of these thinkers, and we can't possibly go into all of their works. I mean, that would be ridiculous. But I think it's good to at least know some of the thinkers and just kind of have like a chronology of their thought, so that you can kind of organize anarchism a little better in that way. So some earlier influences were William Godwin, Giuseppe Mazzini, Pierre Joseph Proudhon, William Hine, Max Stern, and Karl Marx. The reason now Karl Marx has a little asterisk here is because he would not identify himself as an anarchist, but his work is essential to anarchist tradition. And we'll get into that, but his economic analysis specifically is what anarchists focus on as far as Marx. So that's why he's still in there, but he's got a little asterisk. Modern influences, so this is the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century. We have Mikhail Bakunin, we have Peter Kropotkin, Rosa Luxemburg, Emma Goldman, Rudolf Rocker, Alexander Berkman, and George Orwell. You might recognize Orwell, and we might go into a little bit about the Spanish Revolution with him, if time permits. And then we have contemporary influences, which is the mid-20th century to the present. And we've got Noam Chomsky, Joel Olson, Robert Paul Wolff, Murray Bookchin, and then these three also have asterisks: David Graeber, Andrzej Grubaczyk, if that's how you say it, and then Saul Newman. And the reason those have asterisks is because they're considered post-left anarchism. So post-left anarchism is this new wave of anarchism that is basically takes on a postmodern approach and is different, basically. And that's where I'll leave it at for now. And then you got some pictures, of course, down here. You got Joseph Proudhon, Mikhail Bakunin, Rosa Luxemburg, Peter Kropotkin, Emma Goldman, Rudolf Rocker, and Noam Chomsky. And I want to note, too, that Rosa Luxemburg and Emma Goldman were actually very influential anarchists, just as much influential as some of these other thinkers on here. So I always find that very interesting, especially when you look at anarcho-feminism, which is the idea that unlike some of the other social theories that have no women thinkers, especially in the older ideologies and conceptualizations, anarchism has some very popular, prominent female representation, which I think is always nice. And then some key texts that if you were to look further into anarchism, some of these are collections of essays and manifestos. Others are fully conceptualized books and theories. So you've got, and these are in chronological order, so you've got An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice by William Godwin, What is Property, or An Inquiry into the Principle of Right in Government by Pierre Joseph Proudhon, The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Das Kapital by Karl Marx, Selected Writings of Mikhail Bakunin, Essays on Anarchism by Mikhail Alexandrovich Bakunin, Leninism or Marxism by Rosa Luxemburg, Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution by Peter Kropotkin, Anarchism, A Collection of Revolutionary Writings by Peter Kropotkin, The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin, Anarchism and Other Essays by Emma Goldman, and we actually have a reading for that next week. Well, I guess it's part of the Friday assignment, so it would be this week when you're watching this video. We have an Emma Goldman reading from that book. Anarcho-Syndicalism, Theory and Practice, Working Classics by Rudolf Rocker, and On Anarchism by Noam Chomsky. So those are some texts if you want to look deeper into this. I have some excerpts from these texts, but if you wanted a more deeper look into anarchism, those are available as well. And then here is the socialist view of freedom from our text. So you remember that triad conceptualization of freedom with the agent, the obstacle, and the goal. So just going to kind of refresh us on that, because anarchists are socialists. So the agent, or I guess you would start with the obstacle. Well, you can start anywhere, but the obstacle is class divisions, economic inequalities, unequal life chances, false consciousness. So that's the obstacle. So again, class divisions, bourgeoisie versus proletariat, this idea that things are unequal. A goal, fulfillment of human needs, for example, satisfying work, fair share of product. And then the agent, the people to do this, are the common, the working people, the proletariat. And socialism to me is kind of self-explanatory, because it's a critique. I mean, if you've ever worked, if you're a worker, if you've ever done a job, signed up your W-2, your 1099, whatever other tax form you've done, if you've ever worked a job, I feel like you can understand socialism quite well, just as much as you can understand capitalism, because it is a critique of that labor market system. So always trying to just tie this ideas and ideology back to your actual life. It's not some abstract thing. The bourgeoisie isn't some just random concept. It's an actual, it's the owners of the means of production. It's the person that owns the place you're working at and owns all the machinery and owns you while you're on the clock. So some key tenets of revolutionary socialism are: anarchism is the no government system of socialism. So that's from Kropotkin, from anarchist communism. But yes, so it's this idea of it's socialism, but it's a no government system form. And we'll get into more of what that means, but it's this idea that there is no state. Okay? So the liberation of the proletariat must be the work of the proletariat itself. This is from Bakunin. That's a direct comment to not only Marx, but also to the bourgeois socialists, who have this idea that electorally or somehow we can liberate the proletariat by the aristocrats or by the bourgeoisie, or that, the proletariat. No, Bakunin says the proletariat must liberate itself, because the proletariat is the main source producing capital. So thus, in order to abolish capital, the main source of production of capital has to abolish it themselves, which I think is very important. Anarchism rejects all authority and believes in a horizontal organization of power. So once again, talking about that power pyramid, the idea of power being distributed from the top down, or the idea of power being distributed from the bottom up. Who has the most amount of power? In anarchism, it's the worker, it's the individual who has the most amount of power. And through that individual power, they come to collective decisions. So anarchism also believes that democracy should be present in every aspect of society. Social democracy, and thus this should extend to the workplace, where humans spend the most amount of their time. So this idea that every aspect of society should be a democracy, that is what social democracy means. Social democracy. Every part of society is democratized. Not just our government, which eventually the government doesn't exist, but the workplace. The place where you spend the most amount of your time should be a democratic place. Everyone should have a democratic voice, the ability to vote, democratic say in the workplace. That's basically what social democracy means. And that communism, anarchism, socialism, all these other forms under these kind of umbrella terms all stem back to this social democratic idea that, hey, wouldn't it be a radical idea if we extended the values of liberalism, this idea of liberty, fraternity, and democracy, to everyone in society? It's basically the concept. So it adheres to Marx's economic interpretation as laid out in such works as Das Kapital, but strongly rejects the use of the state as an efficient means to achieve a stateless, classless, moneyless society. views any state, even Marx's socialist state, as an enemy. So communism's ultimate goal is a classless, moneyless society, and stateless. Karl Marx does say stateless, classless, moneyless society. And what Bakunin really hones in and attacks Marx for is this idea of, you're saying you want to create a stateless, classless, moneyless society, but you're doing that in the form of a state. So you're saying, because Marx says, okay, let's concentrate all the power into the state, and then from there we can achieve the liberation of the proletariat. Well, Bakunin's saying that doesn't make sense to me, because if you put all the power into the state, how are you going to transition away from the state? Right? So that's kind of a big contention between Marx and Bakunin. But they both agree on the economic interpretations that Marx has laid out. This idea of the bourgeoisie, the idea of the proletariat, the idea that there is an owner class, there is a working class, the working class has no power, the owner class has all the political, all the social power. They agree on the fundamental economic premise of wage slavery, of capital, of property. So that's all very important to consider. So, the big split. And this is basically an image I created from reading Bakunin and Luxemburg and kind of splicing out how things divide. Because they write about it, but they don't give you a nice little pretty graphic. And I think everyone loves a pretty graphic. So, we've got socialism at the top of this. So all of this is under the form of socialism. And as we talked about the socialist view of freedom, we talked about the social democracy and those basic ideals. Then you've got two forms of socialism. And you've got technically more than two forms of socialism, because if you read the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx is going to have like reactionary socialism and bourgeois and German and multiple different types. But this is the more succinct version for our focuses. So you've got the revolutionary socialism and the bourgeois socialism. And we're not going to focus on bourgeois socialism at all. But basically those are like reformist social democrats, people that think we can work within the system to achieve a more social democracy. Revolutionary socialists fall into basically two large camps. You've got the anarchists and you've got the communists. And this has been a big split. Like I said, they both agree on all the tenements, the economic side of socialism, but they disagree with the methodology, how you're getting there. How does the proletariat get the power in the first place? So that's kind of the big split here. They both claim revolutionary socialism, and they both operate under social democracy terms. And their feud is also infamous because it has led to such things as the Spanish Civil War, which I hope I get some time to talk about. But the Spanish Civil War was between the communists, the fascists, and the anarchists. And the communists in that sense were the Soviet Union-style communists, the authoritarian communists. And the anarchists did not like them. And there's a really rich history in Latin America and Spanish culture about anarchism, which is quite fascinating, honestly, if you ever get the chance to study some of that. So, the big split continued. So, Bakunin kind of differentiates, well, what is a revolutionary socialist? What is an authoritarian communist? Let's start with what they have in common. So again, they share this goal, that the creation of a new social order founded only on the organization of collective labor. So this idea that society should be focused on collective labor. Because, capitalism already focuses on collective labor. You don't go into the factory and just produce one little guitar that you're going to take home and you're going to play, and that's the fruits of your labor. You're producing a million guitars. You don't take home a single guitar, but you take home capital, and then you use that capital that you take to purchase something else in the economy. So, labor is already pretty collectively organized, and Marx talks about this too, that the bourgeoisie is creating its own demise by enabling the proletariat to come together as a collective. They equally favor science. So now there are many forms of socialism. There's utopian socialism. There's, religiously inspired socialism. There's tons of spirituality linked to socialism as well, though it's not covered as much. But all that to say, they still favor the scientific method. And now I personally think that the scientific method and spirituality don't have to be exclusive, like you can have one and not the other. But I will note that people like Bakunin or Marx were very atheistic, and they were very much science only at the exclusion of spirituality, which, some people might agree with, some people might not. That's, your own cup of tea. I personally don't err on that side. But they equally favor science, which I still think is important because the scientific method is the most logical way at being able to rationalize the material world. Maybe it falls short when having these bigger spiritual concepts, but when rationalizing the material world, the scientific method is by far the best way to conceptualize it. And then they both have that Marxian economic view that we've talked about. So the methods are where they split. So revolutionary socialists organize with the view of the liquidation of the state. Now, when you look at people like Chomsky, they say that you can still use state power to the benefit of anarchism as long as you have the view of the liquidation of the state. Now, some anarchists would say, that's not enough. You have to actually liquidate the state right in that moment. You can't have any transitory state at all. And communists, the most radical, the most realized form of communism, would also say that, yeah, we want to eventually liquidate the state. So you could say, well, hey now, then what's the difference? Well, the difference is Bakunin is saying, no, we have the view of liquidation of the state, whereas the authoritarian communists believe they must organize the workers' forces to take possession of the political power of the state. So this idea that on the one side, stay away from the state as much as possible, work on revolutionizing outside of the state, but if you happen to use the state, that's okay, because sometimes state power is needed. Chomsky's revision of that, the latter part. But then the other ones are like, no, we have to take political power of the state. That is our central aim, and through that we can achieve all these other things. So then Bakunin also says that revolutionary socialists propagate ideology, anarchists, whereas authoritarian communists impose ideology. Now, that one's very interesting, too, because it's this idea of organic... Both Marx and Bakunin and, most socialists agree that this is just a dialectical. It's Hegelian. It's, following the course of history. This is going to happen regardless. People are going to wake up. People are going to become more conscious. But Bakunin is writing in his time saying, it looks to me as though Marx and the Marxist thinkers of the time... and as we see later with Lenin and then into Stalin, and then, of course, you look at how communism evolved into the nasty, brutish thing that it became, harkens back to this original point that authoritarian communists are imposing an ideology. Come, comrade, or die. And anarchists are saying we need to educate each other and we need to propagate an ideology, but ultimately it comes down to the people themselves to do it. And again, this is where the gray area comes in, because a lot of people can interpret Marx originally, he was stateless, he was classless, he was society, Marx himself maybe was not an authoritarian communist, but Bakunin says your language will create authoritarian communism, which it did. It was used to create authoritarian communism, so that's something to keep in mind. And then you have revolutionary socialists, which believe in social democracy. And then you have authoritarian communism, which believes in centralism. Again, that's kind of also iffy. Those are kind of interchangeable. But these are the words that actually comes from Luxemburg. This idea of social democracy and then centralism. But again, it's all loose for sure. And then revolutionary socialists are the organization of non-political, anti-political, and social power. And then authoritarian communists is the organization of political power. So again, authoritarian communists are focused on the political system. Anarchists are focused on the social system. That's the difference there. And then you have Proudhonism, tongue twister, anarcho-socialism on the one side. So these are kind of just thinking about these basic ideological terms, and then on the other side is Marxism, or the German school, also later Leninism. So again, just different ways to kind of think about these concepts. But the split becomes more apparent as communism evolves. When Marx is first writing, and when Bakunin is first writing, and when Proudhon's first writing, they're split. It's more theoretical because they're writing about, well, this is how things are going to happen. But as it starts to play out, it turns out that Bakunin becomes a very searing warning of what Marxist philosophy could be interpreted as, given the language in which he wrote it. And then it came to fruition. So it was a little bit of an ominous warning. Hello, and welcome back to an exploration on anarchism, coming on to part 2 of this video series. So last time when we left off, we were talking about the split between Marx and Bakunin, and basically the overall premise between revolutionary socialism, the different varieties, and how they play out. Now we're going to look at more of the, I don't want to call it fracturing yet of anarchism, but the evolution of anarchism. So here we have this nice little handy chart with thinkers, and it also follows chronology. And basically it shows the shift in the dominant strain of anarchism of the time. So at the very top here you've got Godwin, and Godwin was most influenced by the Jacobin tradition. So it was an earlier socialist tradition that has a lot more spiritual connotations to it, and was kind of repudiated by materialists, but they still build off of a lot of Godwin's work. So Godwin was the earliest with the Jacobins, and then Proudhon comes in and differentiates himself. He's like, I'm not a Jacobin, I'm a mutualist. But both kind of, Godwin sets up the T for anarchism, and Proudhon tees it. He says this is anarchism, and then he provides what mutualism is. So in their originality, that was the main form of anarchism. But as anarchism evolves, they take on more of mutualism, socialism, communism, like these specific labels, because there is clear little distinctions between them. So you had Proudhon with mutualism, and we'll go into some of what all this means, but just to kind of get an overview of the land. Proudhon with mutualism, and then you come into, after Proudhon, you have Bakunin, who is the first one to, really push anarchism forward. Proudhon starts it, Godwin tees up the ball, well, Bakunin, he completes the race, or he makes significant strides on that race. And we also have Luxemburg here too, because they were right around the same time together, but they were socialists. So we have anarcho-Jacobins, then we have anarcho-mutualists, then we get to anarcho-socialism. And socialism, there's a couple of key little distinct differences between that and mutualism, which we'll get into. And then you get down to Kropotkin, and you start coming into the territory of anarcho-communism. So a more refined, specific version of anarcho-socialism. And then we get to Emma Goldman and Rudolf Rocker, where we really start to see a Unitarian kind of attitude towards anarchism that includes, so all of these theories are building off of each other. It's not like one is arguing against the other. They're all building off of each other, incorporating new information as society continues to evolve, right? Because they're following this chronology. So you have Goldman with Rocker with syndicalism, and that is probably the most lasting, predominant strain of anarchism that we see today, as far as these older conceptualizations of anarchism occur. I mean, all of these, you could theoretically call yourself any of them, and they'd be interchangeable, but if we're being very specific, syndicalism would be the most popular variety of socialism, or not revolutionary socialism, anarchism now. And then you get into Noam Chomsky here. Noam Chomsky basically co-signs with a lot of Rudolf Rocker, so we consider him also a syndicalist as well. But syndicalists have this very, as you'll see with like a quote from Emma Goldman, this very Unitarian perspective when it comes to, and by Unitarian I mean they believe in uniting all of the different branches of these kind of little small anarchist differences. And then you get into kind of modern splits in anarchism and post-anarchism with figures like Olson and others, which we're not going to concern ourselves really at all with this set of slides on anarchism, but that is something to keep in mind as you go into kind of where we are today in the modern world. You look at the Occupy movement, you look at kind of what anarchism has become, especially intellectually. It has gotten swept up in that postmodern tendency to want to philosophize everything out of existence, so to speak. All right, so we've got anarcho-mutualism. We're not going to look at the Jacobin strain because it's kind of earlier and it's a little out of focus for revolutionary socialism. But starting with anarcho-mutualism, we've got Proudhon's principal objection to communism. So his principal objection is it destroyed freedom by taking away from the individual control over his means of production. So he says, because there's a lot of things he looks at communism and says, that's great. The idea that the laborer is getting the just compensation for their capital is great. But what about the freedom? And he's referring to these authoritarian communists, as you see with Bakunin, like authoritarian communists. You could argue that some Marxists are not that. But for authoritarian communists, this idea that they're taking away the freedom and individuality of the worker, because it's still, just like the normal capitalist system, it's still a top-down managed system. So you still have a bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is just in the form of the state instead of the private sector. And so there's still all of those same interstate capitalistic dynamics are occurring. And then you've got socialism based on free markets and usufructs. So usufruct comes from usus, which is use, is the right to use or enjoy a thing possessed directly and without altering it. Fructus, in a figurative sense, is the right to derive profit from a thing possessed, for instance, by selling crops, leasing immovables, or annex movables, taxing for entry, and so on. So basically, everyone has the right to use things, and they have the right to derive profit from them. So this is a little, some people might say, is this even socialism then? Because if they're deriving profit, but it is socialism because it's the workers receiving the full compensation of their labor. You're not just getting a part of it, you're getting the full amount. And it's also allowing for this idea of being able to have things in society based on your contributions to them. So, according to mutualist theory, when a worker sells the product of their labor, they ought to receive money, goods, or services in exchange that are equal in economic value, embodying the amount of labor necessary to produce an article of exactly similar and equal utility. The product of the worker's labor factors the amount of both mental and physical labor into the price of their product. So when we get to Kropotkin and anarcho-communism, Kropotkin says it's simply too unfeasible to calculate the exact value of people's labor. And thus, that's why you just need a communal system where everyone's sharing in the goods, the rewards, and everyone's just putting in as much work, to each according to their ability, to each according to their need. That's the communist part of anarcho-communism. But here with anarcho-mutualism, it is a little bit more technocratic because they're saying, no, we should have a system where we almost almost have like debit and like a system of exchange of markets to somehow reflect the differences in our labor. But unlike capitalism, all of that reward goes to the worker instead of most of it going to the bourgeoisie. So there's not that alienation in production. So anarcho-mutualism also has a basis on is based from Adam Smith's labor theory of value. So basically, it supports markets and property as long as the worker. Oh wait, before we get into that part. So basically, labor theory of value is what we just talked about with the usufructs, with the idea of there's amount that your labor is worth, and then there's a capital amount that can be reflected in that. Now, in anarcho-mutualist society, you may not have capital. It might be some other form of debit in society, but there is still that that exchange between the labor that you did and how it is reflected in society. So that's basically what labor theory of value means. And then, so it's based on Adam Smith's labor theory of value. And then it supports markets, we talked about that, and property as long as the worker has full rights to the product of their labor. So if markets and property come in the way of a worker having full rights to the product of their labor, then they have to go. So anarcho-mutualism also maintains the Marxist distinguishment between private property, productive property, and personal property, real private property. So again, we've talked about that, the difference between private property, which is this idea of property of industry that's being used for production, and then personal property, which is, your laptop, your, dog, whatever, whatever you have in your home, that's yours. And there's a big difference between them. And then anarcho-mutualists say that private land ownership is provisional, so that you can own land, but it's conditioned upon the land being in use. So if think about in Georgia, for example, all these acres and acres and acres of unused land that just have this monetary value that someone has, and they could sell this land if they want to and make a lot of money off of it, but it's not being used. Nothing's being done on the land. In anarcho-mutualism, you can't own that land, because that would be like owning a nothing burger. I mean, you can't own something if you're not actively doing work on it. If you're laboring on the property, if you're doing the work, this goes back to John Locke and Adam Smith, if you're laboring on the property, you're doing the work, then you have natural rights to be there. But if you're not producing anything, do you really have ownership of that land just because someone says you do? Anarcho-mutualists would say no. So they kind of take that Lockean argument of tilling the soil, then that becomes your own your private property, and they take it and they drag it to the extreme. There are parallels between market socialism, so we kind of have been talking about that, the kind of worker cooperatives, workplace democracy, Marxist economist Richard Wolff advocates for, and mutualism. So I can't really go into too much depth here. I highly encourage looking up Richard Wolff on Google, maybe like Democracy at Work, Cure for Capitalism. I could have put the link in there, but I forgot to. But it's a great start to look into Richard Wolff and just kind of understand a feel for him. But yeah, basically, workplace democracy is these ideas of cooperatives, and workers democratically own and share the means of production, and then they compete in a market against other worker cooperatives, and then they profit off of each other. So it's almost like a blend between socialism and this idea of free markets. And then retrospectively, anarcho-mutualism has been called a form of individualist anarchism. So this is kind of one of the more OG anarchisms, and as a result, some people have camped anarcho-mutualism as more individualist than collectivist. As you can hear, a lot of the things I'm saying are more individualistic, but that's also debatable, because a lot of anarchists say that no, we very much favor the collective, but it's through the individual. So the individual empowers the collective, almost like a a small microcosm of a larger thing. So it's kind of iffy, but there are a lot of individualistic aspects of mutualism, so some have called it individualistic. And then, so it's like I just said, ideologically situated between individualist and collective forms of anarchism. Proudhon described the liberty he pursued as the synthesis of communism and property. So that's interesting to think about. Some consider mutualism part of free market anarchism, individualist anarchism, and market-oriented left libertarianism, while others regard it as a part of social anarchism. So it's kind of contentious, and because it's one of the more older forms, it's easier to debate anarcho-mutualism. So then we come into anarcho-socialism. So again, these, as we just talked about with that whole timeline, these are just building off of each other in chronological order. So they're looking at the previous one saying, we could change this, we could maybe do that. And that's the beauty of anarchism, is it follows the trend of human evolution. So it allows you to evolve. It allows the ideology to evolve and to adapt over time. So anarcho-socialism was first articulated via the works of Mikhail Bakunin. It can arguably be considered an umbrella term for anarcho-syndicalism and anarcho-communism. Bakunin focused a lot on the ties between the state and the church, and how the churches/idealists' conceptualizations of God and spirit were being used to perpetuate the enslavement of workers and societal complacency. So, yes, Bakunin was he was atheistic, but I think for a lot of modern day spiritualists, there's a lot of agreement that you can find in the atheistic critique of organized religion. Because a lot of modern day spiritualists do not subscribe to organized religion. They say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And I'm not going to go into all of that right now. But I think it's very interesting because a lot of modern day spiritualists happen to identify as anarchists, but they would definitely not call themselves atheists. But they still resonate with the atheists' critique that the church, is actually, it's a diminutive institution. It's not really of God. It's of man, dominion over other man. So it's interesting to think about. And then whereas Kropotkin focuses more on social Darwinism, so Kropotkin, we'll look at him in just a second, with economic liberalism, Bakunin focuses more on religion. And it should be noted that while many forms of socialism, communism are atheistic, there are spiritual but non-religious variants that come to many of the same materialist conclusions as Bakunin's anarchism. So I was going off of what I was just saying. We'll talk about Kropotkin and social Darwinism in a second. But anarcho-socialism is like kind of this precursor, introducing these socialist ideas, blending them with mutualism, and coming to kind of a mutual arrangement. So some of the things Bakunin laid out was that the main principle of the International Working Man, so they call it the International, and the full title is the International Working Men's Association. And this was where the one that Bakunin joined, that was also with Marx, and they had a big split, and it caused a lot of internal rife, and eventually it dissolved, or at least the anarchist faction of the IWA dissolved. But the main principle of the International Working Men's Association to Bakunin is to politically and socially abolish the class divisions existent in society. So class divisions, very Marxist, and then 2, all territorial states, political fatherlands, and nations. Not very Marxist, because Marx had nationalistic tendencies. He had this idea of that each nation had to first overcome their own bourgeoisie. And Bakunin's like, no, get rid of all the states, political fatherlands, nations right away in order to achieve the abolition of class divisions. See, so one of them has it the other way, one of them has it, so they have it flipped. And that's, how do we get rid of the class divisions? Do we abolish the state, or do we further increase the state? And then these aims would be achieved by establishing an international federation of all local and national productive groups. But note that while he says federation, most anarchism presents as a form of as a more confederal system of workers, as it is individual worker collectives that then form larger organizations. So it's actually, So this idea of like a federation of, and you'll see this with syndicalism too, this idea of like different worker federations coming together, almost like smaller little councils, like little HOAs of workers, and then those little HOAs come together and form bigger and bigger conglomerates. But as you'll see in the Soviet style system, all of those lower branches were the least powerful, and the top powerful were these higher up where all of them fed into. But in anarchism, it's the opposite way. The bottom is the most powerful, and each time they come together to form like a bigger collective body, that collective body is not superseded by the smaller bodies of the individual. So again, power is bottom up, not top down. And then I like this terminology that Bakunin uses. He says the state, he conceptualizes it as a vast slaughterhouse. There's a lot of evolutionary language, animal language, food language, with the anarchist thinkers, conceptualizing, institutions as organs. So I think it's just very interesting that he calls the state a vast slaughterhouse. Just something to think about. And maybe, personal little thinking exercises. In what ways is the state a vast slaughterhouse? And maybe what ways is it not? Here's some just excerpts. We're not going to go into them too much, but just so we can kind of have those so you can think about. From Bakunin. In a word, we reject all authority and all privileged, licensed, official and legal influence, even though arising from universal suffrage, convinced that it can only turn to the advantage of a dominant minority of exploiters against the interests of the immense majority in subjection to them. All right, second quote. The wealth of the bourgeoisie is incompatible with the comfort and liberty of the workers, because their excessive wealth is, and can only be, built upon the robbing and enslavement of the workers. And then the third one, if we speak of a collective dictatorship, even if it were formed of several hundred individuals endowed with superior mentalities, where are the intellectuals powerful enough to embrace the infinite multiplicity and diversity of real interests, aspirations, wishes, and needs which sum up the collective will of the people? Okay, and then here's some quotes from Luxemburg. The tendency for centralization springs from the economic makeup of capitalism, which is essentially a centralizing factor. Centralism is the absolute and blind submission of the party sections to the will of the center and the extension of this authority to all parts of the organization. So we kind of talked about that between bottom up versus top down. Nothing will more surely enslave a young labor movement to an intellectual elite hungry for power more than this bureaucratic straitjacket, which will immobilize the movement and turn it into an automation manipulated by a central committee. How damning was that? Looking at the USSR. All right, and then we come into anarcho-communism. So anarcho-communism comes in later than Bakunin, and socialism just extends that socialism further. So from Kropotkin's Anarchist Communism, anarcho-communism, so that's his essay or book, anarcho-communism is in many ways indistinguishable from anarcho-socialism. It is more specific on how to realize more of the economic realities of Marx than Bakunin is. So again, it's just going to go a little bit further in how do we achieve a stateless, classless society than Bakunin lays out. Most anarchists take socialism to its complete extension, communism, stateless, classless, moneyless. Advocates not only, anarcho-communism advocates not only communal ownership of means of production, but also products, little typo there, advocates not only communal ownership of means of production, but also profits. It's either profits of labor or products of labor, one of the two. So unlike Proudhon or Bakunin, the products of labor. So basically, not only do you own the means of production, but also we are sharing communally in more of the basic necessities, your diapers, your bread, your eggs, anything else. Like, we're sharing in those products of labor. We're not we're not taking some sort of monetary value, as I said earlier. We're not taking a monetary value and exchanging that monetary value for our labor, like mutualists might. And then what makes Kropotkin's conceptualism of anarchism unique is his emphasis on evolutionary socialism, so fighting it back against the social Darwinist claims of economic liberalism. So we'll go into that when we talk about his mutual aid, so I'm going to table that for a second, but something to think about. But he looks at anarchism through the eyes of evolution, where Bakunin doesn't have that, because Bakunin predates Darwin, or is right at the edge of it, so Bakunin doesn't really focus on Darwin as much as Kropotkin does, and Bakunin focuses more on the religious establishments and kind of carving his own way. And Kropotkin relies a lot on Darwin's theory of evolution, and also adds to Darwin's theory of evolution, as we'll see in a minute. And then anarchism sums up the next evolutionary phase, according to Kropotkin. So, this kind of continuum of history, Rocker, that quote about history and the continuum, anarchism is the next step in this evolutionary phase. And you might even say that's after socialism, or at the same time. And then anarchists, mostly unconsciously, words are hard. Anarchists have humans have tendencies that are anarchistic, but they're mostly unconscious. So two main tendencies that humans have that are anarchistic, but we may not be aware of them, is one, we have a tendency towards integrating labor for the production of all riches in common. So we're already doing that. We're already integrating this labor to produce riches for everyone. And then two, towards fullest freedom of the individual in the prosecution of all aims. So we're already striving to be as free of an individual as possible. So then Kropotkin also adds a very essential concept of mutual aid into anarchist philosophy that is probably mutual aid and direct action are the two main things that persist today from anarchism in modern left movements. But one of them is this concept of mutual aid. So he's looking at collective security versus survival of the fittest. And we'll go into what that means in a second. He says that the law of mutual aid is greater than the law of mutual contest. Mutual aid is a chief factor in evolution. So, what is mutual aid? Well, essentially, animals who help each other survive their natural conditions better than those who compete. Noting this capacity exists both in the animal kingdom and human society. So, basically, Kropotkin does this very in-depth 7-year study into evolutionary species in Asia and looks at all the different animals and how they are adapting to the environment around them, and he finds that the ones that seem to survive the most, the quote-unquote fittest, are actually the ones that help each other, like bees. The ones that are collective in orientation and that have this idea to mutually aid one another survive in evolution. And then the unsociable species, the ones that don't help each other, are doomed to decay. So he looks at all the declining predatory species like wolves, for example, and how, because they'll kill each other, and how their populations are dwindling, where some of the most fruitful animal populations are ones that are helping each other. So the vast majority of species live in societies and come together as the best means of fighting against the struggle of life. So the growth of the state tried and is arguably still trying to end existing mutual institutions set up in society. So he says there's this tendency to set up mutual aid in animal kingdom. There's also the same tendency in the human society. And we set up these natural institutions of mutual aid. For example, food distribution, clothing drives, and disaster relief. And he says some of these things that we're trying to set up, these mutual aid concepts, get squashed by the state. As the state grows, the mutual institutions that are organically created in society are kind of brittly broken down. It goes back to like de Tocqueville's civil society. And then here are some excerpts from Kropotkin. He merely considers society as an aggregation of organisms trying to find out the best ways of combining the wants of individual with those of cooperation for the welfare of the species. The chasm between the modern millionaire who squanders the produce of human labor in a gorgeous and vain luxury, and the pauper reduced to a miserable and insecure existence, is thus growing wider and wider, so as to break the very unity of society, the harmony of its life, and to endanger the progress of its further development. It is not love to my neighbor, whom I often do not know at all, which induces me to seize a pail of water and to rush towards his house when I see it on fire. It is a far wider, even though more vague feeling or instinct of human solidarity and sociability which moves me. All right, and then we come into anarcho-syndicalism. So this is considered the modern anarchism. So this is the most common interpretation of that red and black flag behind the screen. So some of the first adherents were Emma Goldman and Rudolf Rocker. So Rocker sees anarchism as a confluence of socialism and liberalism. So he's using liberalism in the same context we use it in this class, and socialism in the same context as well. So he sees it as a confluence of socialism and liberalism, hence libertarian socialism. And then Goldman talks about how it's individual liberty and economic equality. So socialism, individual liberty, liberalism, economic equality, socialism. So it's this synthesis, this syndication. They call it a consistent anarchy, which I kind of like. So it opposes alienated and specialized labor and look forward to the appropriation of capital by the whole of worker. So again, more of the same. See, they really just build on each other. They just have small little differences. That's why it's not really a fracture. It's just as time progressed, they just created a new name. And they also call themselves anarchists, but they wanted to specify that we're adding a little bit here. Again, it's self-correcting. And then basic principles of anarcho-syndicalism is self-management, autonomy, direct action, spontaneity, mutual aid, and libertarianism. So again, a lot of the same things. Direct action might be another thing that's a little out there. So direct action is so you have this tendency, as Kropotkin says, for mutual aid. It's an evolutionary tendency that you have. And direct action is the course in which you manifest your feelings of mutual aid. So I want to help you, and then I'm going to take action to do something. So a lot of modern leftists are much more in favor of getting on the streets, helping people, feeding the homeless right off the bat, joining, a lot of, I volunteer with a church organization that works in Section 8 housing, just giving clothes to people. That's a form of direct action. And it's happening all over the place. And it's not just happening with anarchists. It's, like I just said, it's happening with churches. It's happening with a lot of different things. And again, an anarchist would say, see, this is an example of a natural tendency. No one had to write an ideology for you to help someone. You are already doing that. We just want to expand that, which I think is the beauty of anarchism. And then there's conception of institutions as organs in a larger organism. The state cannot be altered without changing fundamental organs, so evolutionary sequence. So it talks about how basically as we evolve, over time organs become useless. The appendix, there's just stuff that I think it's the appendix, might be saying the wrong part, but there's a part of your body that we don't use at all anymore that is just kind of hanging out there and you can get it. I'm pretty sure it's appendix. Over time, that'll just stop being. That'll cease to exist. As you look at evolution, like, those weaker traits just fade out over time as more favorable mutations occur. So anarchists say the state it's not going to be reformed. You're not going to reform the appendix. Once you no longer need your appendix, you get rid of it. You move it out of the organism and you create a new organism, a larger organism that more represents humanity. So there are no state organizations. Again, it's a federation, and again, they say federation, but it's really more like a confederal system. But a federation of free communities bound together by their common economic and social interests. So you can see where he's pulling from mutualism, and then mutual agreements and free contracts. So again, you can see kind of how it flops back and forth. So you could say that anarcho-syndicalism and anarcho-communism are the two competitive branches of anarcho-socialism. So you got anarcho-socialism, and then between those would be anarcho-syndicalism and anarcho-communism. And syndicalism is more back to the original mutualist ideas of mutual agreements, contracts, more market socialist oriented. And anarcho-communism is still communism, but it's just stateless. It's the true form of communism, you might say. But they still all build on each other. And then you have this idea of non-utopian, it's adaptable, but Rocker and Goldman make it very clear that this is an adaptable, non-utopian, it's not ironclad. It's a workable model on how things ought to be. So workable plans on achieving basic principles. Humans are evolving. They're fluid beings that the state tries to stunt into boxes and cut off their growth. So again, going back to that, what Kropotkin was saying, that the state is cutting off, because Rocker incorporates Kropotkin's argument too. He incorporates all of the previous ones we've talked about. But going back to that the state is kind of flattening civil society. It's hurting these mutual aid institutions. Well, it's also stunting human growth. It's preventing us from achieving the best version of society, because it says, no, we have a state. We don't need to progress any further. We're good where we're at. Things are fine. Anarchists say, no, we can go further. We can do better. And it does this by trying to fix things in the way, the state does this by trying to fix things the way they currently exist. So we kind of already went into that. And then the individual must be free before we can come together collectively. So I pulled that from Goldman, but that's a very common theme, is the individual has to be free before we can come together collectively. Bottom up, not top down. So here's some excerpts from Emma Goldman, and she actually a little bit predates Rudolf Rocker, and her and Rocker had a really good relationship, and she was actually the one originally commissioned to write the anarcho-syndicalist book, or just this overview of anarchism, but she actually declined down the offer and asked her friend Rocker to write it instead. So I just wanted to throw that out there, OG baddie. And we have, there is no conflict between the individual and the social instincts, any more than there is between the heart and the lungs. The one, the receptacle of a previous life essence, the other, the repository of the element that keeps the essence pure and strong. The individual is the heart of society, conserving the essence of social life. Society is the lungs which are distributing the element to keep the life essence that is the individual pure and strong. Real wealth consists in things of utility and beauty, in things that help to create strong, beautiful bodies and surroundings inspiring to live in. But if man is doomed to wind cotton around a spool, or dig coal, or build roads for 30 years of his life, there can be no talk of wealth. What he gives to the world is only gray and hideous things, reflecting a dull and hideous existence, too weak to live, too cowardly to die. I think that might be one of the most powerful sentences in all of anarchism. That sentence right there. That's incredible. And then the third one, anarchism aims to strip labor of its deadening, dulling aspect, of its gloom and compulsion. It aims to make work an instrument of joy, of strength, of color, of real harmony, so that the poorest sort of a man should find in work both recreation and hope. Okay? And then here's some quotes from Rocker. Common to all anarchists is the desire to free society of all political and social coercive institutions which stand in the way of the development of a free humanity. In this sense, mutualism, collectivism, and communism are not to be regarded as closed systems permitting no further development, but merely as economic assumptions as to the means of safeguarding a free community. There will even probably be in the society of the future different forms of economic cooperation existing side by side, since any social progress must be associated with that free experimentation and practical testing out for which in a society of free communities there will be afforded every opportunity. I love that. Again, that shows really the open adaptability of anarchism. And look how he talks about how there'll be existing forms of economic cooperation. I mean, there already is existing. There already are worker cooperatives existing right alongside capitalist enterprises in the economy. So that's the beauty of capitalism, and it's the beauty of socialism and especially anarchism is, these, evolving from feudalism and then from slavery, is that they're allowing more and more abilities to experiment with different ways of doing things. There's a great deal of freedom if you allow human will to not be squashed by the state, essentially. And the second quote, freedom is the very essence of life, the impelling force in all intellectual and social development, the creator of every new outlook for the future of mankind. The liberation of man from economic exploitation and from intellectual and political oppression, which finds its finest expression in the world philosophy of anarchism, is the first prerequisite for the evolution of a higher social culture and a new humanity. So here we're going to look at a little bit more of a quote-unquote fracturing of anarchism. So we really have focused a lot on the socialism side, the collectivist, the anti-capitalist, if you will. And then we briefly touched on that mutualism. And see how Pure Proudhound is right in the middle there, in between socialism and mutualism. His little property is theft. That's about the extent to which we covered anarchism. That's as far as the split we explored. But there's been a lot of more modern conceptions of anarchism, and even before modern terms, but more right libertarian-oriented, capitalistic-oriented forms of anarchism. So you got like Georgism here, and then you've got capitalism, so you've got like the school of like the Austrian school, the Chicago school, you got Ayn Rand, anarcho-capitalist, so Friedman, a laissez-faire, so very, very different interpretation of libertarianism and liberalism, and we saw that on the liberalism chapter with the split between economic liberals and the other kind that I'm blanking on at the moment. So here's one way of conceptualizing, like I said, modern schisms and anarchist ideology, and then I want to note how isn't anarcho-capitalist an oxymoron, as the two ideas are fundamentally opposed? Many anarchists laugh at anarcho-capitalists because they see it as an oxymoron. Because this, as you can see, this whole lineage of anarchism that we've explored is very anti-capitalist. So, and that was the original people who called themselves just anarchists. They didn't say anarcho-communist, anarcho-socialist, anarcho-syndicalist at first. They just said anarchist. And that was what anarchism was. But now we have this anarcho-capitalist, anarcho-communist, anarcho... So you kind of just throw an anarcho on everything. So there's the individual's categorizations of anarchism, like I said, are controversial due to the inherent nature of original anarchism. So we just talked about that. And then black and yellow versus black and red, big gulf. So the black and red is this libertarian socialist flag. Black and yellow is anarcho-communist flag, anarcho-capitalist flag. And there's a big gulf between anarcho-capitalists and anarcho-communists, but there's less of a gulf between anarcho-communists and libertarian socialists, revolutionary socialists, and other forms of communism. So black being just anarchism and red being communism. Okay, and then this is just, we're not going to go into these at all, but just to kind of another way to visualize some of these different forms of anarchism as they've split off is you got anarcho-communism, collectivism, syndicalism, mutualism. So we covered all those pretty much. And then you've got individualist anarchism, we didn't really talk about, anarcho-pacifism, and then these are, okay, so these are the more postmodern ones, anarcho-pacifism, green anarchism, anarcho-primitivism, which basically wants to go back to an earlier form of society when we were more of a hunter-gatherer civilization, anarcho-feminism, and then LGBT anarchism. And then anarcho-feminism should be interesting to note because the original pioneer of anarcho-feminism would definitely be Emma Goldman, because she had unique to her anarchist analysis was a lot of women's issues. You know, she favored free love, and so of course, like, she was an advocate of birth control and the liberation of women, and was against the patriarchal form of marriage that also Pateman's against. So always an interesting form of anarchism to think about. And then I just want to look at this on the political compass, and then this is a source pool that someone has created to kind of map out different ideologies on the political compass. You remember when we first did it that you have authoritarian up here, socially, libertarian socially, and then you've got libertarian economically, and then you've got, or not libertarian economically, but you've got capitalist economically, and then you've got more communist economically. So how do we feel about the labels generated here? So we are here would be where our ideology is. But look how they have anarchism almost all the way to the right, like the right-left. It's with where mutualism is makes sense, where syndicalism is makes sense. We didn't talk about anarcho-collectivism, but it's very similar to anarcho-communism and socialism. Rocker does mention it, but there's just not as many prominent writers about it, so it wasn't easy to kind of just read something and provide you some excerpts on. But isn't anarchism really an umbrella term for left libertarianism, syndicalism, anarcho-socialism, anarcho-collectivism, and anarcho-communism? So it's a little confusing that just anarchism by itself is over here on the right. But anarcho-capitalist makes sense, and then mutualism makes sense where it's at too, given that it kind of straddles the fence. But just think about that. Like, how do you feel about this and where things are placed? Does it seem accurate to you? And then just a quick note on some contemporary anarchism and social democracy. So anarchism is not so much the proposal of militant workers anymore. This comes from Chomsky, but has passed on new leaves in leftist thought and movements. Actually, no, this comes from Rocker. So examples are peace and green movements, youth and student movements, women and gay movements, communalist and cooperative movements, and then nihilists in underground Bohemia, and then spirit of revolution. So sorry for the typos. It was a little last minute. But yeah, so basically, anarchism isn't, you don't see the anarchist party in a lot of countries. You don't see the anarchists, going up to, because I mean, well, they also don't believe in parliamentarianism. You see anarchists in all of these other movements. They're a part of it. They're a left libertarian outcry for some of these movements, and a lot of these movements are still focused on parliamentary reform. And Chomsky and a lot of modern anarchists say we have these clear ideal sets, but we also recognize that there are things we can do within the state that will help at least achieve more of a sense of what we embody, if you will. So I just want you to note, we're not going to talk about them, but just maybe look it up on your own if you want to have a little extra information. But the Occupy Wall Street movement, the anarchist communes across the U.S., there's a lot of anarchist communes that are popping up everywhere, and a lot of people just checking out, saying, we're going to create our own little society. Note the market socialism in the works of Richard Wolff on worker self-determination. So again, if you get a chance, Google Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism on YouTube. It's a great video if you want to learn a little bit more about worker cooperatives. And then there's a vibrant libertarian socialist scene in Latin America and some European states like Spain. So even if they don't have, now there are some actual anarchist parties in Latin America. So I stand corrected on what I said earlier. But there are definitely anarchist parties in Latin America. But in Europe, like even the top like workers' parties, like in Spain, they're socialist communist, but they're anarchist variety because you look at like the Mondragon Corporation and stuff. It's more market socialist oriented. And then of course in Latin America, there's outright anarchist parties as well. And then there's and there's all different varieties of anarchisms. There's uh, militant anarchists. There's pacifist anarchists. There's um, a lot of different conceptualizations of anarchism. But I hope you enjoyed that. That was a brief overview. There's some supplemental sites and sources. I'm going to see if we can post the slides on D2L as well. Um, but that's all I got for you. So that was an exploration on revolutionary socialism.